They said he carried entire cities in his head. Not maps, not sketches, not notes hidden in shoes or sewn into coats. Streets, intersections, back alleys, guard posts, patrol timings, license plates, staircases and fire escapes and broken cobblestones that could twist an ankle in the dark. He walked through a place once, and it belonged to his memory forever. That's why the resistance chose him. That's why the enemy never found anything on him. And that's why, years later, when people asked how he survived, he would only smile and say, "Because I never had anything to hide, except what was in my mind." He had been a quiet boy long before the war, the kind whose teachers called him strange, because he could recite entire pages after reading them once. He remembered conversations word for word. He could walk a new route home and trace it perfectly on the table with his fingertip after dinner. His mother thought he was gifted. His father warned him not to show off. "People fear what they don't understand," he said. "Best to keep some things to yourself." He learned that lesson well. When his country fell under occupation, when uniforms replaced ordinary clothes in the streets and posters appeared on every wall, demanding obedience in a language that wasn't his, he lived as quietly as he could. He watched, listened, memorized, and stayed invisible. At least, that's what he thought. One night, in the back room of a bakery that no longer sold much bread, a woman in a worn coat slid a piece of paper across the table. On it was a rough sketch of a city he had never seen. "Can you remember this?" she asked. He studied it for a few seconds and nodded. Then, with a pencil, he began correcting it. "This alley is too wide. The square is shaped more like this, and there's a narrow pass between these two buildings. You missed that." She stared at him. "You've been there." "No," he said. "But I can see how it should be. Whoever drew this wasn't paying attention." She didn't smile. She simply took back the paper, folded it, and said, "Come with me." By the end of the month, he was no longer just another citizen under occupation. He was something much more dangerous, a courier of information with no documents, no codes, and nothing to search. The first time they sent him out, he traveled under a false name to a nearby town. His instructions were simple and terrifying. "Walk," the woman told him. "Walk as if you lived there. Go everywhere. The market, the station, the main square, the side streets, the bar near the corner. Don't look like you're searching for anything. Just exist there. Then come back." "That's all?" he asked. "That's everything," she said. "When you return, you will tell us where the enemy sleeps, where they drink, where they gather, and how they move. And you will never write it down." He spent 2 days in that town. He watched soldiers lean their rifles against cafe chairs, heard the way their laughter echoed off the walls. He noticed which buildings had fresh paint and which windows were always lit late into the night. He followed trucks with his eyes until they disappeared behind warehouse doors. He counted the time between patrols by the church bells. On the third day, he returned. In that same bakery back room, he closed his eyes and began to talk. He described street names, building colors, doors with chipped handles, the exact number of steps between the station and the square. He listed guard rotations without hesitating, mentally retracing his footsteps. When he finished, the room was silent. One of the men there, a former officer before the occupation, asked, "You're sure of this? You didn't write anything down?" "I don't need to," he replied. The man leaned forward. "If even one detail is wrong, people die." He met his gaze and said quietly, "Then I won't be wrong." The operations that followed proved he wasn't. Sabotage teams slipped in and out of the town without ever bumping into patrols. Supply depots went up in flames. Ammunition convoys were derailed. Each mission seemed guided by a hand that knew the city better than any map. He moved on to bigger places, cities where trams cut through crowded streets, where banners fluttered above government buildings, where officers traveled in cars with blacked-out windows. He walked among them as if he were invisible, eyes open, ears tuned to every echo. He would arrive as a traveler, a clerk, sometimes as a railway worker, sometimes as a man looking for a job. His stories were always simple. His face was always ordinary. That was his greatest weapon. No one remembered him. What they didn't see was the work happening inside his mind. He didn't just recall streets. He layered them. He built entire cities in his head, like living diagrams, adding doors and windows, staircases and rooftops, routes to escape and angles of fire. He remembered the smell of oil near the rail yard and the way boots sounded different on stone and wood. He knew that a certain alley echoed too loudly to run through at night, and that one narrow path behind the church remained in shadow even at noon. And when he returned, he sat in quiet rooms, closed his eyes, and reconstructed everything for the resistance. His memory saved lives, but it also painted a target on his back. One evening, after months of moving in and out of occupied cities, he returned to find the bakery door unlocked, the curtains inside swaying. The flour dust on the floor was smeared. A chair was overturned. He knew immediately. Someone had talked, or someone had listened who shouldn't have. He turned to leave. The street outside was too quiet. "Don't bother," a voice said from the shadows. "We've been waiting for you." They arrested him without struggle. Resistance fighters were dangerous. A resistance fighter with nothing on him, even more so. They searched him thoroughly. No paper, no codes, no maps. Nothing. "In your house, then," the officer said. "Hidden somewhere. You people always write everything down. You can't help yourselves." He stayed silent. Interrogation rooms were all the same. Bare walls, a table, one chair bolted to the floor. They sat him under bright lights and asked him where the others were, how he passed messages, what he carried. "You cannot know so much without records," one interrogator insisted. "No one remembers that kind of detail." He looked at the man and said softly, "You'd be surprised what people remember." They tried everything. Threats, shouting, promises of mercy. They left him alone for hours in the dark, then burst in and demanded answers. He never lied. He simply refused to say anything worth hearing. The dangerous thing about him, they realized, was that there was nothing to find. No secret notebook, no cipher key, no coded letters hidden in seams. His mind was the only vault. "You must have stories," one officer said one night, leaning back in his chair. "A trick? A system? Something." He thought about answering, telling him about how he walked a city like you read a book, line by line, corner by corner, how he would mentally stand in an intersection and turn slowly, labeling each direction, memorizing every sign, every lamppost, every doorway, how he could close his eyes afterward and be there again, standing at the same crossroads in his mind. Instead, he shrugged. "I pay attention," he said. "That's all." They kept him for weeks. At one point, he heard gunshots in the courtyard and knew someone had broken before him. He knew they expected he eventually would too. But there was something different about his burden. He carried it in a place they couldn't touch. Eventually, they let him go. Not out of kindness, out of doubt. They couldn't prove anything. Without evidence, keeping him was a waste of time and cells. One officer signed the release with a frown. "If we catch you again," he said, "we will not be so patient." He nodded, knowing that if they ever caught him again, they would never see him leave. He should have run, left the country, crossed a border, and vanished into a life where his biggest concern would again be broken roofs and worn tools. Instead, he went back to work. He visited more cities, larger ones, places where trains converged and orders flowed. This time he moved more carefully. He stayed fewer nights. He changed his gait, his haircut, the way he held his shoulders. He watched how people looked at him and adjusted accordingly. His name spread through the resistance. They called him the map with no paper, the man with 1,000 streets in his head. Some joked he was half machine. Others, after hearing how he'd walked out of an interrogation alive, started using another name. "Ghost," one young courier whispered. "He goes into their cities, walks past their officers, sits in their cafes, and walks back out. No one remembers him, like he isn't even there." He didn't argue, but the more cities he carried, the heavier his mind felt. Sleep became difficult. Some nights, when he closed his eyes, he would find himself lost in the labyrinths inside his head, wandering streets in 3 different places at once. Faces blended together. Voices overlapped. There was no ink to smudge, no paper to burn. But memory had its own dangers. It trapped everything, even what he didn't want to keep. One mission pushed him to the edge. He was sent to a key industrial hub, a city pulsing with factories feeding the war. His job was to walk it as if he were a worker seeking employment, to learn which buildings carried fuel, which stored ammunition, which housed officers. He spent 3 days there. On the 4th night, he sensed something wrong. The patrols moved differently. The conversations in cafes quieted when he entered. A woman in a doorway watched him too long. He left that same night. On the way back, his train was stopped. Soldiers boarded, checking papers. One stared at him longer than the others. "Haven't I seen you before?" the soldier asked. He smiled faintly. "I don't think so. I would remember." They let him pass. When he finally reached the resistance safe house, he collapsed into a chair and spoke for nearly an hour. Routes, factories, fuel depots, weak spots in the railways. They wrote nothing down. They didn't need to. Operations followed. Explosions shook the city he had walked through. The war machine slowed, choked by precision. He heard later that the enemy was hunting someone, a phantom who walked among them, a spy who left no trail. He listened quietly and stirred his tea. After the war ended, after flags changed and uniforms disappeared from the streets, people who knew even a fraction of his story asked why he'd never left any records, why there were no diaries, no lists, no confession of what he'd carried. "That was the point," he said. "If they had found my notes, they would have found all of you." "And now?" an old comrade asked. "You could write it all down now, for history, for truth." He looked out the window at the city he had known for so long that he could walk it blindfolded. Once he might have recited every corner. Now he chose not to. "I've spent enough of my life living inside maps," he said. "Some things are better left unwritten." He never published a memoir, never appeared in parades, never stood in front of cameras. He went back to repairing radios in a world that no longer needed him to memorize entire towns, just to keep people alive. But sometimes, late at night, walking home alone, he would pause at a crossroads and stare down a street no one else found remarkable. And in that moment, Whole cities stirred inside his memory, places he hadn't visited in decades, still intact and perfectly mapped in his mind. He would smile, just a little, and keep walking. He was the spy who never carried codes or plans, the man who could reconstruct a city after seeing it once, the man who walked through danger with nothing for his enemies to seize, the man who never got caught. Because the real evidence was something no search could ever uncover. It lived quietly and forever in his head.